So here's an example that focuses on how to use some of these relationships. I won't go through it with you because I think you all get it, but feel free to work through it if you want a check to make sure you understand it. The basic idea in this case is you're given a company with both debt and equity, and you have a particular capital structure that you need to work backwards from to calculate what the value of the share price is. And so you need to use some accounting relationships to be able to take into account net cash flows. Not accounting earnings, but net cash flows. And you'll have to back out the various different components because the company goes on beyond year 7, it grows. So you're going to need to piece together the different parts of the company's life and then use the annuity discount formula as well as the perpetuity formula to calculate what the value is. In the end, when you do that, you'll notice that the value is going to be a combination of what happens between years 1 and 7, and then from years 8 out into forever. When you piece the two together, you can actually get a very simple answer, which is $169.2 million. And ultimately, when you calculate the price per share, it's going to be $29.40. A couple of subtleties with this example is you need to take into account working capital, and you need to take into account capital expenditures. Capital expenditures are the pieces of equipment that we buy and in some cases sell. Those are going to affect your net cash flows even though they don't necessarily have a big impact on earnings unless, of course, you are taking some kind of accelerated depreciation. The second subtlety is this notion of working capital. The idea behind working capital, as you, I'm sure, recall from introductory finance, is that some businesses, you actually need cash to run the business. For example, if you're building an inventory of drugs or devices, you need to pay the various different vendors to be able to supply you with the inputs to create those products so you can have them on your shelves in inventory. That costs something. You need to use cash in order to run that business. If you shut down the business, at some point you will get that cash back. So changes in working capital need to be taken into account when you're evaluating a particular project. So those are the only two subtleties that are probably not things that you might find obvious. There are many other examples where you can use these evaluation methods, and you'll be asked to work on a couple of those examples as part of your problem set. But the basic summary about capital budgeting, the standard way, is that use cash flows, not accounting earnings, use after-tax cash flows, and then you'll have to focus on the cash flows that are just attributable to the project. You don't want to take into account sunk costs. You want to focus on those particular costs that are directly relevant to the project. And that can be challenging in some cases when you're dealing with a large company and you're making use of shared facilities. You have to figure out how to apportion the cost of those shared facilities to this particular project. Otherwise, you may be grossly overestimating the value of the project because you're assuming that some of the inputs are actually free. So here's yet another numerical example that I will let you take a look at on your own. This is an example of a device manufacturer that makes use of various kinds of accounting relations. Take a look at that, and you should be able to calculate what the ultimate decision is. One thing to keep in mind in this example is there are certain sunk costs that it's very tempting to include in the calculations, but the fact that they're sunk means you can't get them back, they're gone, it's history. The focus is to move on and look at the project as a standalone. The other point about capital budgeting is project interactions. If projects are independent, that's pretty straightforward. Apply the NPV rule to them. But if they are dependent, you're going to have to take into account some kind of dependence in a very specific way. For example, if they're mutually exclusive, that's pretty straightforward. But if they have certain kinds of dependencies, like you can do one after the other, you may have to spend a little bit more time thinking about the subtleties. So here's an example of that. Imagine if you've got a particular product and the value of that product increases over time because the demand happens to increase as you wait. If that's the case, then the question is, when is the optimal time to launch the product? You can't launch it more than once. You're going to launch it, and then the project is going to go. If you wait, you might actually be able to do better by allowing the market to grow. And so here's an example where what you're asked to do is to calculate the growth rate of your NPV. So you calculate the future present value of the project if you started not today, but next year, if you started the year after, if you started the year after that, and then you bring it all back to present value and you ask the question, at what point is the growth rate of my present value going to be equal to the growth rate of the profitability of this particular market? And in this case, year 3 seems to be the sweet spot, assuming that the growth rate stays below 10% thereafter. If it doesn't, then you've got a much more complicated optimization problem. But we rarely have curves that go up and down and up and down. Typically, forecasts either look like this, or like that, or like that. Not a lot of subtlety in the way we forecast cash flows.